They told you that slavery was a system of total submission. They told you that for 400 years, the enslaved people of America waited for a white president to sign a piece of paper that would set them free. They taught you that resistance was rare, futile, and usually ended at the end of a hangman's noose. But they lied. Decades before the Civil War turned the fields of Gettysburg red, there was another war raging in the swamps of the American South. It was not a war of armies lining up in neat rows. It was a war of ghosts. It was a war of shadows. And it was fought by the only group of people in American history who managed to construct a thriving, armed, independent society of free black men and women right under the nose of the slave power. They were called the Black Seminoles. They were escaped slaves who had fled into the unforgiving wilderness of Florida. They allied with the Seminole Indians, learned the ways of the swamp, and forged a new identity. And when the United States Army came to drag them back into chains, they didn't run. They didn't beg. They loaded their rifles. Led by a brilliant, mysterious tactical genius named John Horse, they waged a 40-year guerrilla war that humiliated the United States government. They defeated generals. They ambushed patrols. They survived in a landscape that killed white soldiers just by existing. They forced the U.S. government to do the unthinkable, to negotiate with them as equals. This is the story of the largest slave rebellion in American history. But it wasn't a rebellion that lasted a few days. It was a revolution that lasted a generation. But before we wade into the swamps of Florida, I have a question for you. This is a story about defying the odds and standing your ground when the whole world is against you. I want to know where you are fighting your battles from today. Whether you are in Atlanta, London, Lagos, or a small town in the Midwest, drop your city in the comments below. Let's map out the resistance right here. To understand this war, you have to understand the map of North America in the early 1800s. To the north, you had the expanding United States, a hungry empire fueled by cotton and slave labor. But to the south, you had Florida. At the time, Florida was a Spanish territory, wild, ungovernable, and dangerous. For a slave working on a plantation in Georgia or South Carolina, Florida was the promised land. It was the only place where the slave catchers couldn't go. If you could survive the run, if you could dodge the patrols, the dogs, and the alligators, and cross the border into the Spanish swamps, you were free. Thousands made the run. They were called Maroons. They built villages deep in the Everglades. They grew crops. They raised families. They carried weapons. And they formed a unique alliance with the Seminole Indians, a tribe that was itself a collection of refugees pushed off their lands by the Americans. The Seminoles and the Black Maroons created a dual society. The Black Seminoles lived in their own towns, had their own leaders, and maintained their own African traditions, but they paid a tribute of corn and livestock to the Seminole chiefs for protection. In return, they became the tribe's warriors, interpreters, and advisors. It was a utopia in the middle of hell, a place where a black man could look a white man in the eye and not lower his head. But the United States could not let this exist. It wasn't just about the land. It was about the example. A free, armed black society sitting right on the border of the slave states was a terrifying threat to the plantation owners. It was a beacon. As long as the Black Seminoles existed, every slave in Georgia knew that freedom was possible. The plantation owners demanded that the U.S. government invade Florida, destroy the Seminole towns, and drag the stolen property back to the fields. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson, the future president, invaded Florida. This was the first Seminole War. He burned villages. He seized territory. But he couldn't catch the people. They melted into the swamps. By the 1830s, the United States had officially acquired Florida, and they wanted the land cleared. They passed the Indian Removal Act. The goal was to force all Native Americans to leave their ancestral lands and march west to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears. The U.S. government told the Seminoles they had to go. But for the Black Seminoles, the stakes were higher. The government considered them escaped property. If they surrendered to be moved west, the white slave owners were waiting at the collection points with shackles. They would not be sent to Oklahoma. They would be sent back to the sugar plantations. For the Black Seminoles, this wasn't a political dispute. It was an existential crisis. It was liberty or death in its purest form. Enter John Horse. He was born a slave in 1812, but he grew up free in the Florida wilderness. He was a mix of African and Native American blood. He was tall, striking, a master marksman, and a polyglot who spoke English, Spanish, and the Seminole dialects. He wasn't a chief by blood, but he was a chief by ability. The Seminole leaders, men like Osceola and Wildcat, relied on him. They knew that John Horse understood the white man better than they did. He knew how the Americans thought, how they fought, and how they lied. When the U.S. Army arrived in 1835 to force the removal, confident that a few thousand savages and runaways would crumble before the might of the American military, John Horse and the Seminole chiefs made a pact. They would not go. They would make the swamps of Florida a graveyard for the U.S. Army. The American generals, men like Wiley Thompson and Clinch, were arrogant. They viewed the Black Seminoles as confused servants who were being held hostage by the Indians. They didn't realize that the Black warriors were the spine of the resistance. They didn't realize that they were walking into a trap set by men who had been hunting in these swamps since they were children. On December 28, 1835, the war exploded. Major Francis Dade was marching a column of 110 U.S. soldiers through the Florida pine forests. He was confident. He was loud. He had a cannon. Suddenly, the palmetto bushes came alive. John Horse, Osceola, and hundreds of warriors opened fire from point-blank range. It was a massacre. The U.S. soldiers, trained to fight in straight lines like they were in Europe, were cut down before they could even unlimber their cannon. Within hours, 108 of the 110 men were dead. It was the worst defeat of the U.S. Army at the hands of indigenous forces until Custer's last stand 40 years later. The Dade Massacre sent a shockwave through Washington. The government realized this wasn't a police action. It was a full-scale war. They poured money and troops into Florida. They sent their best generals. They sent the Navy. They vowed to crush the rebellion in a matter of months. But they didn't understand the enemy. They were trying to fight a conventional war against the first modern guerrilla army. John Horse and his men didn't fight to hold territory. They fought to bleed the enemy. They would strike a supply convoy and vanish. They would lure a unit deep into the swamp, where the horses would sink in the mud and the soldiers would die of malaria, and then pick them off one by one. They used the environment as a weapon, the sawgrass that cut like razors, the heat that caused heat stroke, the snakes. The Black Seminoles were at home in this nightmare. The white soldiers were terrified of it. For the next 7 years, the Second Seminole War raged. It became the Vietnam of the 19th century. It cost the U.S. government $40 million, billions today. It cost the lives of 1,500 soldiers. And for years, they couldn't win. Why? Because the Black Seminoles knew that surrender meant slavery. A Seminole Indian might surrender and be sent to a reservation. A Black Seminole who surrendered was sent to hell. So they fought with a ferocity that terrified the Americans. General Thomas Jessup, one of the U.S. commanders, wrote a letter to Washington that admitted the terrifying truth. He wrote, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war." He realized that the engine of the resistance was the black warriors, and he realized that he couldn't defeat them with bullets alone. he would have to use treachery. By 1837, the United States Army was desperate. They had thrown everything they had at the Florida swamps. They had sent thousands of regulars. They had sent volunteers from Tennessee and Georgia. They had sent the Navy to patrol the coast. And they had nothing to show for it but a long list of dead soldiers and a treasury that was bleeding money. General Thomas Jessup, the commander of the U.S. forces, was a man at the end of his rope. He was a career soldier, a man who believed in the rules of war, but Florida was destroying his reputation. He realized a terrifying truth. He could not defeat John Horse and the Seminole chiefs on the battlefield. They were too fast. They knew the terrain too well. Every time he tried to pin them down, they evaporated like mist, only to strike his supply lines 10 miles away. So, General Jessup made a decision that would stain the honor of the U.S. Army for a century. He decided that if he couldn't beat them with tactics, he would beat them with treachery. He decided to weaponize the one thing the Seminoles still respected, the white flag of truce. In October 1837, Jessup sent word to the Seminole leaders. He offered a parley. He suggested that peace was possible, that a treaty could be signed allowing the Seminoles to stay in the south of Florida. It was a lie. It was a trap designed to decapitate the resistance in one stroke. Osceola, the charismatic war chief of the Seminoles, and Wild Cat, the fiery young prince of the tribe, agreed to meet. They brought with them John Horse. The presence of John Horse at this high-level meeting is crucial. It proves his status. He wasn't just a translator, he was a diplomat and a general, the representative of the Black Maroon Nation. He walked into the meeting under the white flag, trusting the word of an American general. As soon as the Seminole delegation entered the camp near St. Augustine, the trap snapped shut. U.S. soldiers, hiding in the brush, surrounded them. Muskets were leveled. There was no negotiation. There was no treaty. They were seized, shackled, and dragged away. The capture of Osceola made headlines around the world. It was a scandal. Even in a nation used to breaking treaties with indigenous people, capturing an enemy under a flag of truce was considered a new low. But Jessup didn't care about public opinion. He had the leaders. He assumed the war was over. He threw them into the Castillo de San Marcos, then known as Fort Marion in St. Augustine. The Castillo is a fortress out of a nightmare. Built by the Spanish hundreds of years earlier to stop pirates and British fleets, it is a massive star-shaped structure made of coquina, a sedimentary rock composed of seashells. Coquina is unique. When you shoot a cannonball at it, it doesn't shatter. It absorbs the impact. The walls are 20 feet thick. It is impenetrable from the outside and inescapable from the inside. John Horse and Wildcat were thrown into a dark, damp cell deep within the fortress. For Osceola, who was already sick with malaria and a broken heart, the prison was a tomb. He would soon die in captivity, a martyr to American treachery. But John Horse and Wildcat were not ready to die. They looked at their cell. It was a stone box. The door was heavy iron, guarded 24 hours a day by sentries who had orders to shoot to kill. The only source of light was a single embrasure, a slit window high up near the ceiling, about 18 feet off the floor. The window was tiny. It was barred with rusted iron grates. It measured maybe 9 inches by 2 feet. A child could barely fit through it, let alone a grown warrior. The U.S. Army felt secure. They had the most dangerous men in Florida locked in a stone coffin. They began to plan the deportation. They would ship the Indians west to Oklahoma. And the black prisoners? The slave catchers were already circling the fort, clutching their bills of sale, waiting to reclaim their property and drag them back to the sugar fields. John Horse knew this. He knew that for him, the Castillo wasn't just a prison. It was a holding pen for hell. If he didn't get out, he would die in chains. So, he and Wildcat devised a plan. It was a plan born of pure desperation and biological mastery. They looked at the tiny window. They looked at their own bodies. And they realized that to escape, they had to disappear. Literally. They went on a hunger strike. They pretended to be sick. They refused the meager rations of bread and pork. For days, they sat in the darkness, meditating, praying, and starving. They needed to lose bulk. They needed to shed every ounce of fat and muscle that would prevent them from squeezing through a hole the size of a shoebox. It was a grueling physical ordeal. Their ribs began to show. Their cheeks hollowed. They grew weak. To the guards looking in, they looked like broken men, dying of grief. The guards relaxed. They stopped checking the bars so closely. Why worry about men who can barely stand? But the weakness was a weapon. On the night of November 29th, 1837, the moon was dark. The fort was silent, save for the rhythmic footsteps of the sentries on the ramparts above. Inside the cell, John Horse and Wildcat made their move. They had fashioned a makeshift rope out of the bedding they had been given. It was thin, fragile, but it was their only lifeline. Because of his height, John Horse boosted Wildcat up to the window first. The Seminole chief grabbed the iron bars. They had managed to loosen one of the rusted bars just enough, perhaps with a knife smuggled in, or perhaps just through weeks of secret, patient grinding against the stone. Wildcat removed the bar. He pulled himself into the opening. It was agony. Even after the starvation, it was a tight fit. The jagged stone scraped the skin off his chest and back. He had to dislocate his shoulder to squeeze his frame through the narrow aperture. He pushed. He wriggled. He fought the stone. And then he was through. He tied the rope and dropped down into the moat. The moat was dry, but it was a long drop into the mud. Now it was John Horse's turn. He was a bigger man than Wildcat. He had broad shoulders, the build of a heavy laborer. He climbed up to the window. He pushed his head through, then his shoulders. He got stuck. Imagine the terror. Hanging 18 feet above the stone floor, half in and half out of a fortress wall, unable to move forward or backward. If the guards heard him grunting, if they saw his legs dangling, it was over. He would be shot in the back. He exhaled. He forced every molecule of air out of his lungs to collapse his ribcage. He scraped his flesh against the coquina rock. He pushed with a strength born of the absolute refusal to be a slave again. And he popped through. He slid down the rope into the moat, landing beside Wildcat. They were bruised, bleeding, and starving, but they were outside. They weren't safe yet. They were at the bottom of a moat, surrounded by American sentries. They had to crawl through the mud, avoiding the patrols, until they reached the ponies they had arranged to have hidden in the nearby scrub. Or, according to some legends, they stole horses from the army stables. They rode. They rode hard. They didn't stop until they were deep back in the swamps, back in the sanctuary of the Everglades. When the sun rose over Fort Marion the next morning, the guards opened the cell door to find it empty. They looked up at the tiny window, high on the wall. They looked at the width of the hole. They couldn't believe it. It seemed physically impossible. The news of the escape hit the U.S. Army like a thunderbolt. General Jessup was humiliated. The savages he had captured through treachery had outsmarted him. They had ghosted through stone walls. But the real impact was psychological. When John Horse and Wildcat reappeared in the Seminole camps, it was like seeing men return from the dead. They told the tribes about the treachery. They told them about the prison. They told them that the white man's word meant nothing. Any hope of a negotiated peace evaporated instantly. The escape radicalized the resistance. The Seminoles and the Black Maroons realized that surrender was not an option. There would be no more talks. There would only be war. John Horse rallied the Black warriors. He told them that the only thing protecting them from the auction block was the rifle in their hands. He reorganized his forces. He prepared for the inevitable American counterattack. The U.S. Army, stung by the embarrassment, mobilized for a massive offensive. They sent Colonel Zachary Taylor, another future president, with 1,000 men to crush the rebellion once and for all. They wanted a decisive battle. They wanted to draw the Seminoles out of the swamps and destroy them in open combat. John Horse and the chiefs decided to give them what they wanted. They chose the battlefield. They chose a hammock, a dense island of trees, on the north shore of Lake Okeechobee. They built fortifications. They cut firing slits in the sawgrass. And they waited. It was Christmas Day, 1837. The Battle of Okeechobee was about to begin. It would be the largest battle of the Seminole Wars, and John Horse was placing his black warriors front and center. He knew that Colonel Taylor would send his troops straight into the swamp muck. He knew they would be slow. He knew they would be targets. The escape from the Castillo de San Marcos was the prelude. The main event was about to start. The United States Army was marching south with flags waving and drums beating, expecting a rout. They were walking into a slaughterhouse designed by a man they had tried to chain. Christmas Day, 1837. In the churches of Boston and Philadelphia, choirs were singing about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. But in the swamps of Central Florida, there was no peace. There was only the wet, sucking sound of boots sinking into mud and the metallic click of hammers being pulled back on flintlock rifles. Colonel Zachary Taylor, who would one day become the 12th President of the United States, stood on the edge of a vast swamp near Lake Okeechobee. He was known as Old Rough and Ready. He was a man of the old school, a believer in the bayonet charge and the straight line. He looked out at the terrain before him with contempt. It was a nightmare. A half-mile of sawgrass, razor-sharp grass that stood 5 feet tall, rising out of a slurry of black mud and water that was knee-deep. Beyond the grass was a hammock, a dense island of cypress and oak trees, shrouded in moss and shadows. Taylor knew the Seminoles were in there. His scouts had found the trail. He had over 1,000 men, seasoned U.S. Army regulars and a regiment of Missouri volunteers, militiamen who had bragged in the taverns back home that they would hunt the savages for sport. Taylor outnumbered the enemy nearly 3-1. He believed in the brute mathematics of war. He ordered a frontal assault. He didn't know that he was doing exactly what John Horse wanted him to do. Inside the hammock, John Horse, Wildcat, and the Prophet Alligator had prepared a kill zone that would be studied by military historians for decades. They hadn't just hidden behind trees. They had engineered the battlefield. They had cut firing slits into the sawgrass so they could see the soldiers approaching without being seen. They had notched the trees to steady their rifles for long-range shots. And they had positioned their forces with a specific political purpose. John Horse placed the Black Seminoles, the Maroons, at the most critical point of the line. This wasn't an accident. The black warriors knew that if the line broke, they couldn't surrender. The Seminoles might be taken prisoner, but the black men would be re-enslaved or executed on the spot. They had the most to lose, so they would fight the hardest. They were the anvil upon which the U.S. Army was about to be smashed. At 12:30 p.m., the sun was high and hot. The Missouri volunteers stepped into the swamp. The mud grabbed them immediately. It was thick, foul-smelling sludge. The horses couldn't move in it, so the men had to dismount and wade. Their boots stuck. They stumbled. The sawgrass sliced their hands and faces. They were slow, loud, and clustered together. Perfect targets. They made it about halfway across the open swamp. And then the hammock exploded. The volley of fire from the Black Seminoles and their Indian allies was devastatingly accurate. The first wave of bullets didn't hit the privates. It hit the officers. John Horse had trained his men to target the leaders. Within minutes, the commander of the Missouri Volunteers, Colonel Gentry, was shot dead. The lieutenant colonel was hit. The majors were hit. The command structure of the regiment was decapitated in a single breath of smoke. Panic swept through the volunteers. These were men who were used to bullying defenseless villagers or hunting runaway slaves with dogs. They were not used to walking into a wall of lead fired by disciplined marksmen. They broke. They turned and ran, splashing frantically back through the mud, screaming, throwing away their rifles. Colonel Taylor was furious. He watched his volunteers disintegrate. He drew his sword. He ordered the regulars, the 6th Infantry, to advance. "Damn it!" he reportedly shouted. "We will take that hammock or die in the mud." The regulars were tougher. They were professionals. They marched into the swamp, stepping over the bodies of the Missourians. But the Black Seminoles were ready for them too. The battle turned into a grind. The Black warriors fought with a tactical sophistication that stunned the Americans. They utilized a fire and displace strategy. They would fire a volley, then slip back into the shadows of the cypress trees, reload, and fire from a new position. They were ghosts. The U.S. soldiers were firing at muzzle flashes, hitting nothing but wood and moss, while they themselves were being picked off like ducks in a barrel. For 3 hours, the Battle of Okeechobee raged. The water of the swamp turned red. The screams of the wounded mixed with the war cries of the Seminoles. John Horse moved up and down the line, directing fire, rallying his men. He was fighting a defensive action, holding off a superior force to buy time for the women and children to escape across the lake in canoes. By late afternoon, the U.S. Army had taken the hammock, but the cost was catastrophic. 26 U.S. soldiers were dead, and 112 were wounded, a massive casualty rate for the Indian Wars. The Missouri Volunteers had been shattered as a fighting force. And what did they find when they entered the trees? Nothing. John Horse and his people were gone. They had melted away. They had slipped into the canoes and vanished across the lake into the endless Everglades. They had inflicted massive damage, humiliated the army, and escaped with their freedom intact. Colonel Taylor declared victory. He wrote a report to Washington, claiming he had driven the enemy from the field. It was the kind of victory that loses wars. He had won a patch of mud, but he had failed to capture the leaders or break the resistance. But something shifted after Okeechobee. The victory tasted like ash. General Thomas Jessup, watching the casualty lists mount, watching the treasury drain, and reading the reports of black men fighting like Spartans, came to a realization that no American general had ever admitted before. He realized he could not win this war with bullets. He looked at the map of Florida. It was a fortress of nature. As long as John Horse and his men had the will to fight, they could stay in those swamps forever. They could bleed the United States for another 10, 20, 30 years. The cost was too high. The embarrassment was too great. So General Jessup did something radical, something treasonous to the Southern way of life. He decided to negotiate with the property. He sent a message to John Horse. But this time, it wasn't a trap. It was an offer. Jessup wrote to Washington, crafting a legal argument that would allow him to end the war. He argued that the Black Seminoles shouldn't be treated as returned slaves. He argued that they should be treated as prisoners of war. This distinction is massive. You don't return a POW to a plantation master. You keep him, or you exile him. Jessup proposed a deal. If the Black Seminoles surrendered, they would not be returned to slavery. They would not be sent back to the masters in Georgia, who were screaming for their return. Instead, they would be shipped west to the new Indian Territory, Oklahoma, along with the Seminoles. They would be free. It was the first time in American history that the U.S. government was forced to grant freedom to a group of armed black rebels simply because the government couldn't defeat them. John Horse received the offer. He was suspicious. He remembered the chains at Fort Marion. But he also looked at his people. They were starving. They were tired. The war had lasted for years. The children were growing up in the mud. He agreed to meet Jessup, but on his own terms. He arrived at the parley fully armed, flanked by his best sharpshooters. He looked the general in the eye. "You want us to stop fighting?" John Horse essentially said. "Then give me your word. No slavery. We go west as free men. We keep our guns." Jessup, desperate to end the Negro War, agreed. He promised them freedom. He promised them land in the West. He signed the papers. It was a victory. The Black Seminoles had forced the empire to blink. In 1838 and the years that followed, the Black Seminoles began to surrender. They boarded the ships that would take them across the Gulf of Mexico, up the Mississippi River, and onto the Trail of Tears. But this wasn't a defeat. It was a strategic withdrawal. They were leaving Florida, yes, but they were leaving as free men and women. They had looked at the institution of slavery, leveled a rifle at it, and blown a hole in the wall. However, the promised land of Oklahoma turned out to be another trap. As the Black Seminoles arrived in the West, they found that the U.S. government's promises were written in disappearing ink. The white settlers in the territory and the civilized tribes who owned slaves, like the Creek and the Cherokee, looked at these free, armed black people with hatred. They started to kidnap them. They started to sell them back into slavery. The Attorney General of the United States issued a ruling stating that Jessup's promise was invalid because a general cannot free slaves. The legal sharks began to circle. John Horse realized that the war wasn't over. It had just moved 1,000 miles to the west. He was in a new land, surrounded by new enemies, and the government had betrayed him again. He looked at his people. He saw the fear returning to their eyes. And the general made a new plan. If America wouldn't let them be free, they would leave America. He looked south, across the Red River, across the barren plains of Texas, toward the border of Mexico. In Mexico, slavery had been abolished. In Mexico, a man was a man. John Horse decided to lead the greatest exodus in American history since the Pilgrims. He would take his people on a desperate dash across the entirety of Texas, hunted by the U.S. cavalry and the Texas Rangers, to reach the Rio Grande. It was going to be a race for survival. A Mad Max chase through the desert with women and children in wagons, pursued by the fiercest slave catchers on the continent. The promised land of Oklahoma turned out to be a prison without walls. When the Black Seminoles arrived in the Indian Territory in the early 1840s, they expected the freedom General Jessup had signed his name to. They expected land. They expected safety. What they found was a legal and physical trap that was slowly tightening around their necks. The Cherokee and Creek nations, who had been forcibly removed to the territory alongside them, had adopted the white man's practice of chattel slavery. They looked at the free, armed, independent Black Seminoles living in their midst not as brothers, but as lost capital. Then, the final hammer dropped. The Attorney General of the United States issued a ruling from Washington. He declared that General Jessup had exceeded his authority. A general, he argued, did not have the constitutional power to emancipate property. Therefore, the freedom papers held by John Horse and his people were void. Legally, they were slaves again. The consequences were immediate. Slavers from the Creek Nation began to raid the Black Seminole villages. They would snatch women washing clothes in the river. They would grab children playing in the fields. They would drag them to the slave markets of Arkansas and Louisiana and sell them to the highest bidder. The U.S. Army, stationed in nearby forts to keep the peace, stood by and watched. They had their orders. The Black Seminoles were property, and property could be repossessed. John Horse looked at the situation with the cold clarity of a tactician. He saw the walls closing in. He saw his people being picked off one by one. He realized that the United States would never keep a promise to a black man. In 1849, he held a council with Wildcat, the Seminole chief, who had escaped the Castillo with him. Wildcat was disgusted by the treatment of his tribe and his black allies. Together, they looked at the map. To the east was the United States, the land of chains. To the north was cold and more white settlements. To the west was the unknown. But to the south, across the vast, dangerous expanse of Texas, lay Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. The Mexican government, eager for settlers to protect their northern border against the Comanche, had sent word, "Come to us. We will give you land. We will make you free." It was a desperate gamble. To get to Mexico, they would have to cross the entire state of Texas. Texas was no longer an independent republic. It was the newest state in the Union, and it was a slave state. It was patrolled by the Texas Rangers, men who were famous for their ruthlessness, their horsemanship, and their hatred of Indians and black people. If they were caught in Texas, there would be no trial. They would be enslaved or executed. John Horse didn't hesitate. He gathered his people. "We are leaving," he said. "Pack only what you can carry. If you stay, you die a slave. If you come, you might die free." In November 1849, the Exodus began. It wasn't a military column. It was a migration. There were about 300 Black Seminoles and a few hundred Seminole Indians. There were wagons loaded with corn and babies. There were old women walking with canes. There were herds of cattle and horses. And guarding the flanks were the warriors, the veterans of the Florida Wars, armed with rifles, eyes scanning the horizon. They moved at night to avoid the heat and the eyes of the settlers. They slept in the day, hiding in ravines and dry riverbeds. They were a moving city, a caravan of hope cutting a dusty scar across the Texas plains. But you cannot hide a movement that size for long. The word got out. The Maroons are running. The pursuit began. It was a coalition of nightmares. There were Creek slavers who wanted their property back. There were Texas Rangers who wanted the glory of catching the famous John Horse. There were U.S. cavalry detachments. It was a hunt. The journey took months. They faced thirst. They faced starvation. They faced the Comanche, who controlled the Texas plains and viewed any intruders as targets. John Horse had to use diplomacy as much as firepower. When they encountered Comanche raiding parties, he rode out to meet them. He spoke their language. He offered gifts. He negotiated passage. The Comanche, respecting the reputation of the black warriors, often let them pass. They knew that a fight with John Horse would cost them too many men, but the slavers were relentless. They tracked the wagon ruts. They found the campfires. They were closing in. By June 1850, the caravan reached the final obstacle, the Rio Grande. The river was the finish line. On the far bank was Mexico, freedom. On the near bank was Texas, slavery. But the river was high, and the pursuers were close. Scouts galloped back to the main column with terrifying news. The Texas Rangers, led by the famous Captain Rip Ford, along with a posse of Creek slavers, were just hours behind. They were riding hard. They could smell the dust of the caravan. John Horse made a decision. There was no time to build proper rafts. There was no time to find a shallow ford. They had to cross now. The scene at the riverbank was chaotic urgency. The wagons were driven straight into the water. The horses were whipped into the current, swimming for their lives, pulling the floating wagons behind them. Women held their babies high above their heads to keep them dry. Men swam alongside the cattle, shouting, driving the beasts toward the Mexican shore. John Horse stayed on the Texas side. He and his best marksmen formed a rear guard. They took up positions in the scrub brush. They checked their priming pans. They waited. They would buy time with their lives if necessary. They could hear the thunder of the Rangers' horses. They could see the dust cloud rising in the north. As the last wagon floated across the current, reaching the muddy bank of Mexico, the first Ranger appeared on the ridge. Captain Rip Ford looked down at the river. He saw the caravan on the far side. He saw the black warriors standing on the Mexican bank, rifles raised, daring him to cross. He stopped. He knew the law. The Rio Grande was an international border. If he crossed it, he was invading a sovereign nation. It would be an act of war. But more than that, he looked at the positions John Horse had taken. He looked at the discipline of the men on the far bank. He realized that if he rode into that water, his men would be sitting ducks. The river would run red with Ranger blood. The Rangers fired a few shots in frustration. The Black Seminoles fired back, their bullets splashing in the water. A warning. Come and get us. Ford turned his horse around. He knew he had lost. The property had stolen itself. On the Mexican side, a cheer went up that must have startled the birds from the trees. Men and women fell to their knees in the sand. They kissed the ground. They were tired. They were wet. They were hungry. But they were free. The Mexican officials met them at the border. They were true to their word. They welcomed the refugees. You are no longer slaves, they told them. You are Mexican citizens. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. The Mexican government didn't give them land out of the kindness of their hearts. They gave them land in Coahuila, in the northern desert. Why? Because that land was being ravaged by Apache and Comanche raids from Texas. The Mexican army couldn't stop them. They told John Horse, "We will give you this land. We will give you citizenship. But in return, you must protect the border. You must fight the Apaches." John Horse looked at his warriors. They were tired of fighting, but they were good at it. It was the only trade they knew. "Done," he said. And so, the Black Seminoles became the Los Mascogos. They became the elite border guards of Mexico. For the next 20 years, they patrolled the Rio Grande. They fought the Apache. They fought the Comanche. They fought bandits. They became legendary in northern Mexico. They were the Black Angels who protected the villages. But the United States wasn't done with them. The slave owners in Texas looked across the river with greed and hatred. They saw millions of dollars in property living free just a few miles away. They organized raiding parties, filibusters. Mercenary armies funded by Texas planters invaded Mexico with the specific goal of capturing the Black Seminoles and dragging them back. In 1855, a massive force of Texas Rangers and mercenaries crossed the river. They planned to wipe out the maroon settlement of Nacimiento. They thought it would be easy. They thought they would catch them sleeping. They walked into a buzzsaw. John Horse had expected them. He knew the Americans would never let them go. He had fortified the town. When the Texans attacked, they were met with a crossfire that decimated their ranks. The Black Seminoles, fighting on their own land for the freedom of their wives and children, fought like demons. They routed the Texans. They chased them back across the river. It was a humiliating defeat for the Texas Rangers. It proved once and for all that the Black Seminoles could not be re-enslaved. This victory secured their place in Mexico. They built homes. They planted crops. They celebrated their freedom. They had won the war that started in the Florida swamps 20 years earlier. But the story has one final ironic twist. After the Civil War ended in the United States in 1865, the U.S. Army found itself fighting a new war against the Apache and the Comanche in the West. The U.S. cavalry was struggling. They didn't know the terrain. They couldn't find the water. The U.S. generals remembered the men who had beaten them in Florida. They remembered the men who had held the border in Mexico. And they made a call. They invited the Black Seminoles back. The United States Army offered John Horse and his men jobs. They asked them to return to the U.S., not as slaves, but as paid U.S. Army Indian scouts. It was a surreal offer. The same government that had tried to enslave them, that had chased them across a continent, was now begging for their help. John Horse was old now. He was tired. But he looked at his young men. They were warriors without a war. They needed money. They needed a future. He agreed. In 1870, a group of Black Seminoles crossed the Rio Grande back into Texas. They rode into Fort Duncan. They were sworn in. They were given the blue uniforms of the U.S. Army, the same uniforms that had once hunted them. They became the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. For the next 40 years, they were the secret weapon of the U.S. Army in the West. They scouted for the Buffalo Soldiers. They tracked the Apache. They fought in the most dangerous campaigns on the frontier. And in all those years of service, fighting in hundreds of skirmishes, the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts achieved a record that is statistically impossible. They never lost a man in battle. Not one. 4 of them won the Medal of Honor. But despite their service, despite the medals, despite the fact that they had saved the U.S. Army time and time again, they were never granted full citizenship. They were never given the pensions they were promised. They remained outsiders, living in a shantytown on the edge of the fort, heroes without a country. When the Black Seminoles rode back across the Rio Grande in 1870, they didn't look like soldiers. They looked like a nightmare the U.S. cavalry had been having for 40 years. They wore a chaotic mix of buckskins, Mexican sombreros, moccasins, and surplus Union Army jackets. They carried buffalo rifles and machetes. They spoke a pidgin dialect of English, Spanish, and Seminole that baffled the white officers. But when they moved through the brush, they didn't make a sound. When they tracked a trail, they could tell you not just how many horses had passed, but how tired they were and what the riders had eaten for breakfast. The U.S. Army had hired them out of desperation. The Apache and Comanche wars were raging in Texas, and the white cavalry was getting hammered. They were blind in the desert. They needed eyes. And the best eyes on the continent belonged to the men who had humiliated the Army in Florida. They were designated the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. It was a clumsy, bureaucratic name for the deadliest special forces unit of the 19th century. They were stationed at Fort Clark, near Brackettville, Texas, but they weren't allowed to live in the barracks. The racial laws of Texas and the Army still applied. They built a shantytown along Las Morris Creek, constructing huts out of mud, sticks, and scavenged canvas. It was a slum, but it was their slum. It was the first home they had had on American soil since they were forced into the Florida swamps. Their commander was Lieutenant John Bullis. Bullis was a Quaker from New York. He was a small, wiry man with a handlebar mustache and a temper like a rattlesnake. He commanded the scouts not from a desk, but from the saddle. He rode with them. He starved with them. And unlike almost every other white officer of the era, he respected them. He knew that his life depended on their skills. The relationship between Bullis and the scouts became the stuff of frontier legend. He was the only white man they trusted. They called him the Whirlwind. He called them my children. A paternalistic term, yes, but one spoken with fierce affection. For the next decade, this unit engaged in a series of operations that defy belief. They didn't fight in formation. They fought like the Apache fought. They would disappear into the vast, waterless expanses of the Pecos River country for weeks at a time, carrying only dried meat and coffee. They could survive where regular troops would die of thirst in 3 days, and they had a record that is statistically impossible. Between 1873 and 1881, the Scouts fought in 26 major engagements and countless skirmishes against superior numbers. They were always outnumbered. They were always deep in enemy territory. and they never lost a single man in combat. Not one scout was killed in action. Not one was seriously wounded enough to be left behind. It was a streak of invincibility that spooked the Comanches. The indigenous warriors began to believe that the Black Ones had strong medicine, that they were ghosts who couldn't be killed. The defining moment of their heroism came on April 25th, 1875. It is known as the Pecos River Skirmish. Lieutenant Bullis took 3 scouts, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, and John Ward, on a patrol to track a band of Comanches who had stolen a herd of 75 horses. 4 men against the wilderness. They tracked the Comanches to a crossing on the Pecos River. They crept up to the edge of a cliff. Looking down, they saw the enemy. But it wasn't a small raiding party. It was a force of about 30 Comanche warriors, heavily armed and ready for a fight. 4 against 30. Bullis should have retreated, but he was aggressive and he trusted his men. He ordered the attack. The 4 men opened fire from the rocks. They managed to kill 3 Comanches and wound a 4th in the first volley. For 45 minutes, they held the 30 warriors at bay, using their marksmanship to create the illusion of a larger force. They actually managed to cut the stolen horses loose. But the Comanches were seasoned fighters. They realized they were only facing 4 men. They began to flank the position, using the rocks to creep closer. They were about to encircle the scouts and wipe them out. Bullis realized the jig was up. "Fall back!" he yelled. "Get to the horses!" Factor, Payne, and Ward scrambled back to where they had tied their mounts. They swung into the saddles. They turned to ride for their lives. But as they looked back, they saw a terrifying sight. Lieutenant Bullis was stranded. His horse, spooked by the gunfire, had broken its tether and bolted. The officer was on foot, hundreds of yards away from safety, with 30 screaming Comanche warriors closing in on him. He was a dead man. The 3 scouts were safe. They were mounted. They could have ridden away. No one would have blamed them. Bullis was a white officer. They were black men who had been treated like dirt by the country Bullis represented. The smart survival move was to leave him. They didn't hesitate for a second. Isaac Payne yelled, "We can't leave the lieutenant!" They wheeled their horses around. They rode back into the kill zone. They rode straight into the incoming fire. Imagine the scene. 3 black men in ragged clothes galloping through a hail of arrows and bullets, firing their carbines with one hand. John Ward provided covering fire, dropping Comanches who tried to rush them. Isaac Payne rode up alongside the running, stumbling Bullis. He reached down, grabbed the officer's hand, and swung him up onto the back of his horse. Some accounts say it was Bullis grabbing the tail of the horse and being dragged vaulted up. With Bullis clinging to Payne and Factor and Ward blasting a path through the enemy, they punched their way out of the encirclement. They rode hard until the Comanches gave up the chase. They had saved their commander. They had saved the white man. When they got back to Fort Clark, Bullis was shaken. He knew he owed his life to those 3 men. He sat down and wrote a recommendation that was unprecedented for the time. He recommended Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, and John Ward for the Medal of Honor. And amazingly, the Army listened. The medals were awarded. 3 black men, former slaves or sons of slaves, men who lived in mud huts and were denied citizenship, were given the highest military honor the United States could bestow. There is a famous photograph of the scouts taken around this time. They are standing in a line, holding their rifles. They look dangerous. They look proud. And on the chests of Payne, Factor, and Ward, you can see the medals pinned to their rough coats. It was the peak of their glory. They were the elite. They were the invincibles. But medals don't buy food, and medals don't buy land. While the scouts were winning wars for America, the bureaucracy in Washington was sharpening its knives. The agreement that General Jessup had made in Florida, freedom and land, was dead. The agreement that the scouts thought they had made with the Army in Texas, service in exchange for a permanent home, was never written down. It was a gentleman's agreement, and the U.S. government was no gentleman. As the Indian Wars wound down in the 1880s, the utility of the Scouts began to fade. The Apache were surrendering. Geronimo was captured, tracked, in part, by Scouts. The frontier was closing. The railroads were bringing white settlers by the thousands. These settlers looked at the fertile land along Las Morris Creek, where the Scouts lived. They saw prime real estate occupied by squatters. They didn't see heroes. They saw undesirable Negroes. They began to petition the government. Get rid of them. Take the land back. The Army, which had used the Scouts to clear the way for these very settlers, now faced a choice. Protect the men who had bled for them, or side with the white voters. It wasn't a hard choice for Washington. The rations were cut. The pay was delayed. The orders came down to reduce the size of the unit. John Horse, now an old man, watched this happening with a bitter sense of déjà vu. He had seen this movie before, in Florida, in Oklahoma, in Mexico. The white man uses you, and then he discards you. He tried one last desperate gambit. He decided to leverage his status. He was the legendary John Horse. He had defeated generals. He had saved the border. He traveled to Washington, D.C., or attempted to influence the process through intermediaries, to plead the case for his people. He wanted a treaty. He wanted a deed to the land they lived on. But in the halls of power, John Horse wasn't a general. He was just an old black man with a funny accent. The politicians ignored him. The generals who had once feared him were dead or retired. On his way back to the border, or perhaps while in Mexico trying to secure a backup plan, John Horse was attacked. The details are murky. Some say it was bandits. Some say it was a targeted assassination by Texans still holding a grudge from the escape of 1850. He died as he lived, fighting. The death of John Horse marked the end of the era of the Black Seminoles sovereignty. The head was cut off the snake. Now, the Army could finish the job of dismantling the body. There is a saying that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. But the Black Seminole Scouts didn't fade. They were erased. By the turn of the 20th century, the American frontier was gone. The map was filled in. The railroads crisscrossed the plains. The Apache and Comanche were confined to reservations. The job was done. And the United States Army looked at the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts and saw a relic. They saw a line item in the budget that was no longer necessary. The disbanding wasn't immediate. It was a slow strangulation. The Army stopped recruiting new scouts. They reduced the pay. They let the barracks in the shantytown rot. They waited for the old warriors to die off so they wouldn't have to deal with the problem of their existence. But the scouts were stubborn. They had survived the swamps, the desert, and the Mexican border wars. They held onto their homes along Las Morris Creek with a fierce grip. They believed, with a naive and heartbreaking faith, that the Army would honor the gentleman's agreement. They believed that because they had bled for the land belonged to them. They were wrong. In 1914, the final order came down from Washington. The Seminole Negro Indian Scouts were officially disbanded. It was the end of an era. For 44 years, this tiny unit had served as the eyes and ears of the Army in the West. They had a combat record that was flawless. They had 4 medals of honor. They had never lost a man in battle. But when the unit was dissolved, the Army didn't give them a parade. They didn't give them a pension. They gave them an eviction notice. The commanders at Fort Clark told the families living along the creek that they had to leave. The land was federal property. Now that they were no longer soldiers, they were trespassers. Imagine the scene. Men who were wearing the Medal of Honor on their chests, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, John Ward, were told to pack their meager belongings and get off the post. These were men who had saved the lives of white officers. men who had ridden back into the kill zone at the Pecos River. And now, the country they saved was kicking them into the street. Many of the families had nowhere to go. They had been in the service of the Army for generations. They weren't fully accepted by the black community in Texas because of their unique culture and language. They certainly weren't accepted by the white community. They were refugees in the land of their birth. Some moved across the border to Mexico, returning to the settlements in Nacimiento. Others drifted into the nearby town of Brackettville, taking jobs as ranch hands or laborers, doing the lowest work for the lowest pay. The elite special forces of the frontier became the janitors of the new century. The tragedy of Pompey Factor is the perfect illustration of this betrayal. Pompey Factor was a hero. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "With 3 other men, he participated in a charge against 25 hostiles while on a scouting patrol. He had faced death 100 times, but after the unit was disbanded, he lived in destitution. He applied for a pension. He argued that he was a veteran. The government argued back. They claimed that scouts were not technically soldiers. They were contract employees. Therefore, they were not entitled to full military benefits. It was a legal loophole designed to save money and deny dignity. Pompey Factor, a man who had charged 25 warriors to save his commander, spent his old age worrying about where his next meal would come from. He died in 1928. He was buried in the Seminole Indian Scouts Cemetery in Brackettville. And that cemetery is the final silent witness to the betrayal. If you go to Brackettville, Texas today, you will find it. It is a dusty patch of ground, surrounded by a chain-link fence, under the hot Texas sun. It is not Arlington. There are no eternal flames. There are no honor guards walking the rows. But walking through the gate is a spiritual experience. You see the headstones. They are simple, military-issue stones, and on 4 of them engraved in the marble are the words, Medal of Honor. Adam Payne, Isaac Payne, Pompey Factor, John Ward, 4 of them, resting side by side. It is the highest concentration of Medal of Honor recipients in any private cemetery in the United States. But look at the dates. Look at the surrounding graves. You will see the names of the wives and children who died of malnutrition or disease in the shanty towns. You will see the graves of the men who died of broken hearts after being evicted. The cemetery is a monument to their invincibility in war, but also to their vulnerability in peace. The descendants of the Scouts still live in Brackettville and across Texas. They call themselves the Seminole Blacks, or Masogos. For decades, they kept the story alive in their kitchens and living rooms. They celebrated Seminole Days every September, a family reunion where they told the stories of John Horse and Wildcat. But for the rest of America, the story was dead. The Western movies of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s erased them completely. When Hollywood showed the cavalry charging across the plains, the faces were always white. John Wayne never rode with a Black Scout. The public was fed a lie, a whitewashed version of the frontier where the only black people were cooks or servants. The erasure was so complete that even the terminology was lost. People forgot that the Black Seminoles were a distinct group. They were lumped in with runaway slaves, or just black folks. Their unique culture, a blend of African, Native American, and Spanish influences with their own language, Afro-Seminole Creole, was treated as a curiosity, not a heritage. This cultural genocide was the final objective of the slave power that had started the war in Florida in 1835. They couldn't re-enslave them, so they decided to make them invisible. But the Scouts had one last victory in them, a victory that would take 100 years to achieve. Survival. They didn't disappear. The language didn't die, though it is endangered. The bloodline didn't end. In the 1970s and 80s, historians and linguists began to rediscover the Black Seminoles. They went to Brackettville. They recorded the elders speaking the Creole language. They looked at the Army records and realized that this small unit was actually the most effective fighting force in the history of the Indian Wars. They realized that John Horse wasn't just a bandit. He was a revolutionary leader on par with Zapata or Bolivar. The story began to creep back into the light, but it is still fighting for its place. Even today, the Black Seminoles are fighting a legal battle. They have been denied inclusion in the official Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, the tribe they bled for, the tribe they protected on the Trail of Tears. The issue is money. The Seminole Nation received a massive settlement from the U.S. government for the lands taken in Florida. The Black Seminoles, the descendants of the Maroons, claimed a share. The tribe said no. They argued that the Black Seminoles were slaves, not members. It is the ultimate irony. The people who fought the hardest to keep the Seminole Nation free, the people who refused to surrender in the swamps, are being told in the 21st century that they don't belong. This legal battle is the modern version of the Trail of Tears. It is a fight for identity. It is a fight to say, we were there. We mattered. As we approach the final chapter of this epic, we have to look at the whole arc, from the swamps of Florida to the deserts of Mexico to the courtrooms of Oklahoma. The Black Seminoles were the Unconquered. They were the only group of African Americans who formed an army and forced the United States to sign a treaty with them. That alone makes them titans. But titans can be forgotten if their stories aren't told. The wind blows hot across the flatlands of Brackettville, Texas. It kicks up the dust, coating the chain-link fence of the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery in a layer of fine red grit. It is a quiet place. There are no tour buses here. There are no gift shops. There is just the sound of the wind rattling the dry brush and the silent vigil of 4 Medal of Honor headstones standing guard over a broken promise. But if you listen closely to that wind, you can hear the echoes of the most impossible story in American history. You can hear the splash of paddles in the Florida Everglades. You can hear the thunder of wagons crossing the Rio Grande. You can hear the crack of a Winchester rifle saving a white lieutenant on the Pecos River. As we close the book on John Horse and the Black Seminoles, we must ask ourselves a simple question. Who won? The United States Army had more men. They had more guns. They had unlimited money. They had the law. They chased this small band of people for 40 years, across 3,000 miles and 2 international borders. They tried to enslave them. They tried to starve them. They tried to erase them. But they failed. The Black Seminoles are the only group of enslaved people in the history of the United States who waged a war against the government and forced it to sign a treaty granting them freedom. They are the only ones who built a sovereign nation in the wilderness and defended it against the world's rising superpower. They won. They won because they refused to accept the definition of slave. They looked at the plantation system and decided it was a machine made of wood and flesh, and like any machine, it could be broken. John Horse, the man who led them, deserves to be carved into the side of a mountain. He was a Moses who carried a rifle. He was a diplomat who outsmarted generals. He was a father who led his children out of the house of bondage, not through a parted sea, but through a hail of bullets. Why isn't he on the $20 bill? Why isn't he in every high school textbook? Because his story is dangerous. The story of the Black Seminoles destroys the comfortable narrative of the passive victim. It challenges the idea that freedom was a gift given by benevolent white politicians in 1863. It proves that freedom was seized, inch by bloody inch, by men and women who were willing to burn the world down rather than wear chains. To acknowledge John Horse is to acknowledge that the U.S. Army, the institution we revere as the defender of liberty, spent the first half of the 19th century acting as the enforcer of slavery. It is an uncomfortable truth. It stains the uniform. But we cannot afford to look away. The legacy of the Black Seminoles is not just in the past. It is a survival guide for the present. They taught us the strategy of the maroon. They taught us that when the system locks you out, you build your own system. When the laws are unjust, you move to the borderlands. When you are outnumbered, you use the terrain. You turn the swamp into a fortress. You turn the desert into an ally. They taught us that identity is a weapon. They were black. They were Indian. They were Spanish-speaking. They were American. They were Mexican. They refused to be put in a box. They used their fluidity to survive, shifting shapes to fit the threat. They were the ultimate survivors. And look at what they left behind. They left a lineage of warriors, the Buffalo Soldiers, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st Tank Battalion. They all walk in the footprints of the Black Seminoles. The spirit of no surrender that defines the Black military experience was born in the hammock at Lake Okeechobee. They left a community. The descendants in Brackettville and Nacimiento still gather. They still eat the traditional foods, a mix of African, Creek, and Mexican cuisine. They still speak words of the Afro-Seminole Creole, a language that is a living artifact of their journey. They are the living proof that the genocide failed. But most importantly, they left us a standard. Look at the grave of Isaac Payne. He was a man who had every reason to hate the white man. He had been hunted. He had been marginalized. And yet, when he saw Lieutenant Bully surrounded by Comanches, he rode back. He saved the man who represented the government that oppressed him. Why? Not because he loved the government, but because he loved his honor. He possessed a nobility that the United States could not give him and could not take away. He showed that a savage could have more humanity than a civilized nation. As we stand at the end of this saga, the sun is setting over the Rio Grande. The river flows quietly now, a muddy ribbon dividing two nations. But we know what happened here. We know that this water was once a baptismal font for freedom. We know that wagons floated here. We know that mothers held their babies high above the current. We know that a black general stood on the bank and stared down the Texas Rangers until they turned away in shame. The story of the Black Seminoles is the American Iliad. It is an epic of gods and monsters, of betrayal and redemption. But unlike the Greek myths, this was real. These were flesh and blood people who felt the heat and the hunger, and they are waiting for us to acknowledge them. The army evicted them from the fort. The government denied them their pensions. The tribes denied them their membership. But we can give them something else. We can give them immortality. We are the new scouts. It is our job to track the truth. It is our job to make sure that the name John Horse is spoken with the same reverence as George Washington. One founded a country. The other founded a freedom that the country wasn't ready for. So, here are your final marching orders. If you have watched this series, if you have walked the trail from Florida to Texas, you are now a witness. You carry the weight of the unconquered. Do not let this story slip back into the dust. Share this video. Send it to a history teacher. Send it to a veteran. Send it to anyone who thinks they know the story of the American West. Tell them about the black ghosts who haunted the frontier. And finally, I have one last request. A final salute to the men and women who never bent the knee. Go to the comment section right now. I want you to type the word that defines them, the word that they earned with 40 years of blood. Type Unconquered. Let's fill the comments with a wall of defiance. Let's show the algorithm that the Black Seminoles are still here. Let's show the world that we remember the names. John Horse, Wildcat, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, John Ward. They were the Invincibles. They were the Maroons. They were the greatest guerrilla fighters the world has ever seen. The war is over. The treaty is signed in blood. The land is theirs, forever in our memories. Thank you for watching. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Keep your powder dry. And never, ever surrender. Dismissed.